A new kind of war was evolving on sea and land. A war which turned starvation into a weapon, which used spies and subterfuge to force countries to give up the fight or join it. Now Germany faced a desperate task: to win the war before she ran out of resources, and to win before America joined in and tipped the balance against her. The world's capital ships in 1914 were the products of a Cold War. Britain's HMS Dreadnought had set the benchmark: heavy armour, big guns, fast. Dreadnoughts were bargaining chips in a great naval poker game. Germany had 13 and 7 building, Austria-Hungary 3, America 10, Britain 20. They kept the peace, but then the Cold War turned hot. But mighty as they were, in wartime conditions, these warships seemed more like vulnerable Goliaths. The sight everyone feared: Austro-Hungarian battleship, the Istvan, sunk late in the war by a tiny Italian torpedo boat. In 1914, the German Navy believed torpedoes and submarines might tip the balance their way. A hit-and-run war with little history and no rules. Jackie Fisher, Britain's sharpest admiral, predicted radical change ahead.
The use of submarines has convinced us that in wartime, nothing can stand against them. The submarine is the coming type of war vessel for sea fighting. It means that the whole foundation of our traditional naval strategy has broken down.
A succession of losses early in the war forced the Royal Navy to withdraw her ships to beyond the limits of the German U-boats' range. This suited Britain's strategy to isolate and starve her enemies. At Scapa Flow and Rosyth to the north, at Dover and Harwich to the south, the Royal Navy closed the North Sea to German ships. Here was a use for those huge battleships, as sentinels sealing the exits from the North Sea, stopping Germany's fleet getting out and her vital food and war supplies getting in. The North Sea would become no man's land, a dead sea. The blockade was a brutal vision, brainchild of Maurice Hankey, of the Committee of Imperial Defence.
My belief in sea power amounted almost to a religion. The Germans, like Napoleon, might overrun the continent. This might prolong the war, but could not affect the final issue, which would be decided by economic pressure.
The Director of Naval Intelligence agreed.
Grass would sooner or later grow in the streets of Hamburg, and widespread death and ruin would soon be inflicted.
Germany began the war with a merchant fleet of nearly 4 million tons. Within months, she lost a quarter of her ships, seized in harbours, or caught making a dash into the no-man's land of the North Sea. Lloyd's of London kept a log of every vessel sunk. Their records show that on one day alone, the 8th of August 1914, Germany lost 41 ships. Within weeks, the German government started to ration food. Caroline Ethel Cooper was an Australian stranded in Leipzig since the start of the war. Every week, she wrote to her sister in Adelaide.
My dear Emmy, the government has seized the whole bread, flour and meal supply of the country. We are allowed only 4 pounds of bread and can only buy 1 pound of white flour at a time. Now that the war against neutral ships and food supply has begun, prices rise every week.
To end Germany's isolation, her navy came up with a revolutionary plan. An unarmed submarine over 200 feet long that could carry a cargo of 1,000 tons. In June 1916, the Deutschland set out for America, the first time a submarine had ever tried to cross the Atlantic.
Because of the wet weather and the high-running seas, the deck hatches were closed most of the time. The diesel engines pumped hot, humid air throughout the boat. Sweat ran down the bulkheads, and water leaked around loose rivets. The drinking water tasted like diesel. And every meal the cook cooked had a layer of oil across the top. As we approached the American coast, Captain Koenig ordered the crew to say nothing to anyone about the strains we'd undergone during the trip, and to especially avoid mentioning our seasickness.
Now, after 2 world wars, it's taken for granted that America and Britain are the closest of allies, naturally on the same side. But in the First World War, it wasn't so clear. "8 million Americans had German parents or grandparents. 4.5 million were of Irish descent. Many of them had little love for England. At the outbreak of war, thousands of US citizens had tried to enlist in the German army. And America was enjoying a massive economic boom. Half Britain's war budget was spent in the States. Companies like Bethlehem Steel were swamped with orders. They hauled in 6 times the profits they'd made before the war. The Deutschland was another good customer. Her crew received a hero's welcome. There were dinners in their honor. Captain Koenig was invited to meet the president.
The 3 weeks we spent in the United States were a non-stop party. Everywhere we went, people gathered round us. They all wanted a souvenir of some kind. I even sold the buttons off my shirt and the stripes off my tunic. German families introduced us to their daughters, and we never had to pay for beer.
The Deutschland returned to Germany with a vital cargo of nickel and rubber. The help it gave the economy was nothing compared with the boost to German morale, as even Caroline Ethel Cooper had to admit.
The town is flagged today because the Deutschlanders got safely back. The sight of those red, white and black flags always makes me sick. But I'm glad she got across all the same. It was a sporting run.
But the Deutschland was too small to break the blockade. In Germany and Austria, there were not enough people to work the land, and too many officials trying to ration what food there was.
The situation with the hunger and queues is turning nasty. People wait for potatoes in their hundreds, 4 deep, from 4 in the morning until the afternoon.
The shortages worsened after the terrible harvest of 1916. There were 50 food riots that year.
Oh, what days of terror. Everything's in turmoil. There was havoc in town last night. The window panes were smashed in at Café Kaiserhof. angry crowds were shouting outside bakeries and inns. Up at the castle, they cursed the Major in words I shan't repeat. The army appeared at 11.
Germany also tried to starve her enemies, using her U-boats against Allied merchant shipping. One British admiral was horrified.
Submarines are underhand, unfair, and damned un-English. As for U-boats attacking civilian ships, it is impossible and unthinkable. If they do, their captured crews should be hanged as pirates.
Germany's U-boats in the early years operated under strict guidelines. They gave warnings of their attacks. They did not attack underwater. They gave merchant crews time to escape. They had sunk 250,000 tons in 1914. But Britain built new ships faster than the U-boats could sink them. Far from being choked by the German blockade, the British economy flourished. The British firm Vickers, with a workforce of 78,000, turned out guns, aeroplanes, battleships. The U-boat blockade of Britain would have to be ruthless. But Germany's Chancellor, Bethmann Hollweg, realized the effect this would have on world opinion, as he told Georg von Müller.
Spent the afternoon with the Chancellor, who wished once more to discuss the U-boat question. Bethmann envisaged the remaining neutrals united against us as the mad dog among the peoples of the world. That would mean the end of Germany.
So Germany's admirals had their hands tied. U-boats were ordered to stick to the old rules of war. If Germany was trying to play fair, Britain wasn't. Q-ships looked like unarmed traders, but carried hidden guns. They looked like easy prey, but when submarines came close, the Q-ships uncovered their guns and attacked. To add to the deception, they often sailed under foreign flags. Lieutenant Heinrich Crompton, on the U-41, was caught by just such a trick.
As the two ships came within 300 meters of each other, the steamer opened a heavy, accurate rifle fire from all along the railing, immediately joined by large caliber guns hidden fore and aft. The U-41 immediately returned 3 rounds from the forward gun, all hits to the hull. Throughout the action, this steamer continued to fly the American flag.
On the 1st of February 1915, in response to the British blockade, the Kaiser stepped up his campaign. He declared that all the waters around Britain were a war zone, in which any ships, including neutrals, might be sunk. This decision set Germany on a collision course with America. The pride of the Cunard Line, the Lusitania, was the largest, most luxurious liner in the world. She could carry over 2,000 passengers. There was a ragtime dance written in her honor. On the 1st of May 1915, Cunard posted a list of her departures in the New York Times. Next to it was an advertisement placed by the German ambassador. Those sailing to Britain, it said, did so at their own risk. At 11:30 that morning, the Lusitania left New York for Liverpool. Her captain made light of the submarine threat.
It's the best joke I've heard in many days. This talk of torpedoing the Lusitania.
This is the last picture of her ever taken. The Lusitania sighted the Irish coast on the 7th of May. The lighthouse in the old Head of Kinsale was traditionally used by ships on the Atlantic run to get their bearings. At 2:10, the Lusitania was hit by a single torpedo.
As I watched, one funnel went, then the other, until the ship had gone and the sea was calm, and all you could see was bodies and wreckage of furniture, and everything that had been in the ship, floating in the water.
My husband and I got into a lifeboat, the ropes of which jammed and had to be cut. Since when, I have not seen or heard of my husband.
I've lost all I ever possessed, and my dead boys, ages 11 years and 8.
I was rescued by a trawler. My dear husband was lost, but I had the great satisfaction of finding him on Saturday and seeing him laid to rest in the cemetery in Queenstown.
Police reports were sent to relatives to identify the bodies. 1,200 people died on the Lusitania, including 128 Americans. At the battlefronts in Europe, tens of thousands were dying every day, but the fate of the great Cunard liner overshadowed them. With the sinking of the Lusitania, Germany had crossed a line.
The whole world hates us because we are conducting the war in such a brutal manner, and the brutality is increasing. I was at a party when the report of the torpedoing of the Lusitania arrived. I saw 2 officers' wives who, mad with joy, started to dance about the room. "Don't forget," I said, "that there were also women and children aboard." "That doesn't matter," they said, and danced on. The more who go to the bottom, the better.
The Lusitania came to stand for German barbarity. Britain stirred the indignation with its own propaganda. Posters and even posed photographs rammed home what had happened. The German embassy in Washington received bomb threats. President Woodrow Wilson himself began to see Germany as the mad dog of the world.
In God's name, how could any nation calling itself civilized do so horrible a thing?
It seemed America might clamber down off the fence. But outrage soon gave way to caution. Wilson reassured the nation that America would not go to war.
There is such a thing as a man being too proud to fight. There is such a thing as a nation being so right that it does not need to convince others by force that it is right.
And anyway, war would be very bad for business. Wilson kept the United States prepared but neutral for 2 more years. Germany's policy in America after sinking the Lusitania was complex. She kept her U-boats in check, but not her spies. In 1916, German agents blew up Black Tom Island, a loading depot in New York Harbor. It held 900 tons of ammunition destined for the Allies.
Several thousand persons lined the seawall and acquired a real picture of what the firing line in the European war looks like. The water line was one mass of red glare.
The explosions were so strong, they were felt in Philadelphia, 90 miles away. German agents